call you. Good morning, colleagues. Um, I am Melusi Mtungwa, and I will be very warm welcome this morning to this exciting conversation and discussion that we are going to have. I am Melusi Mtungwa from the Department of Communication Science at the University of South Africa, and I will be steering this program this morning. I will not take a long I won't say much because we have somebody who's going to do the official welcome address, but it's just to welcome you and say thank you very much for being here. I'd like to also welcome everyone who is with us virtually via YouTube. We'd like to also welcome you to this august occasion. A bit of house rules before we continue with our program. Firstly, I would like to advise all those who are with us at the venue of the abolition facilities. If you turn to the right, if you walk straight through the right, you will see the facilities on that end. Can I kindly also request, colleagues, that we keep our cell phones on vibrate or mute so that we do not disturb the conversation this morning. Um, and yes, that will be all for me. And I will be back up here a few times to just steer this conversation. And I hope that we're going to have a great discussion this morning. I will take this opportunity to hand over or request the acting head of the Office of Transformation in the College of Human Sciences, Dr. Vuyoletu Seti Sonamzi, to come up onto the podium and do the welcome address for us this morning. Thank you, Doctor.
Um, Good morning. Can you hear me? You can. Should I lower this, media people? Okay. All right. Colleagues, friends of the college, friends of the University of the Land, everybody who's joining us online, and everybody who's in the venue, thank you so much for being here. I will do my very best to, as Melusi would say, roll my R's so that I sound palatable to those who are listening. Mine is not a very long one. It's actually quite quick. It's just to welcome you. But before I do so, I just want to maybe give a context as to why the Office of Transformation is here in collaboration with the University of Fort Hare this morning. We often get asked, why is the Office of Transformation that is concerned with decolonial studies and African studies so concerned about issues of gender and sexuality and so on and so forth? Why are you so interested? Why isn't a program like this maybe in a more suitable space, one that is more focused on gender and sexuality? My answer to this is always clear. Well, the Office of Transformation, concerns particularly with decolonial studies, with African studies, is very much focused on issues of dehumanization, of marginalization, oppression. We are concerned with rehumanizing ourselves in all of the varieties in which we come, in all of the sexualities in which we come, in all of the shades in which we come. So we are absolutely interested in issues of oppression that affect us across the board. So, with that said, the question therefore becomes redundant as far as I am concerned, because look at the continent, look at Uganda, look at Nigeria, look at Ghana, look at Kailija, I mean, look at Mdanzani, look at Guguletu. Why wouldn't then the Office of Transformation, with a special concern on decolonial studies and African studies, not be concerned about these issues of oppression, dehumanization? If we seek to rehumanize ourselves, we must do so across the board. With that said, we take a lot of inspiration from the words of Simon Gori, who I will not quote directly today, who says, I'm not oppressed just because I am Black, but I'm oppressed because I'm Black and gay and HIV positive and living in the location and Sutu and. So it goes on and on and on. So ours is to create safe spaces for all people who face oppression in every corner of the continent, in every corner of the world in which they may exist. So we seek to correct issues of oppression within and without, right? Because those who are oppressed and dehumanized are oppressed and dehumanized within and without, in their own communities as well as outside of their communities. We are oppressed because we are Black women and we are supposed to be silent and submissive and quiet and seen and not heard. So that is our concern. We are oppressed because we present as more feminine than what masculinity requires of us. We are oppressed because we present as more masculine than what femininity requires of us. There's a lot that we need to deal with. And so our concern cuts across the board, which is why we're here. Colleagues, well, why am I giving a lecture? Okay, colleagues, I would just like to say thank you so much for joining us. The Office of Transformation is so proud to host you. The college is proud to host you. The University of the Land is proud to host you. I would just like to say thank you for to all of our guests and welcome. I would also like to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. GIBSON NCUBE, who has been here before. When I greeted him, I said welcome home, because he is basically home in this space. He's been here with us before, presenting another keynote speech, so we are quite familiar with him and his work. We are very happy to host you again. The panelists who are going to be discussing today's presentation, you are much welcome, and of course, our dear collaborator, Professor Zetuma Tebeni, who will be joining us online, I imagine, as well as presenting a video later on. Thank you so much for being here with us. With those short words, Namgelegile, please remove your jackets, as I see you have already. There is coffee and everything else in between. The one thing we will do, and I'm proud of, is that we will feed you in this institution. We are a college of human sciences. We do not like hungry people. We also don't like to be hungry. So there's coffee and all kinds of refreshments that side. Let's have all the fun that we normally have together. And I hope to see you here plenty and plenty of times from now on. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you to Dr. Seti for those words of welcome. Um, you have done it all. There's nothing left for me to say, but to just reiterate to all of you who are joining us that welcome to the University of the Land. We welcome you. We are grateful for your presence, and we hope to be in conversation and engaged in today's conversation. A great welcome to this book discussion and launch of Prof. GIBSON NCUBE's beautiful offering, Queer Bodies in African Films. To waste no further time, colleagues, I would like to request Dr. Belida Panda to join me on stage to introduce Prof. Ncube before he comes and shares his nuggets of wisdom on this beautiful text of his. Dr. Panda, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, colleagues, friends here in the venue and also online. Molweni linjani? Molweni linjani? Dumela? Nkosi kakhulu. Program director, thank you very much. And also thank you very much to all Dr. Seti for a very warm welcome to the University of the Land. As the program director has already said, my name is Belita Banda, but I prefer to be called Miss B. I'm so excited to be here and also to have the opportunity to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. GIBSON NCUBE. Dr. GIBSON NCUBE holds a PhD from Stellenbosch University, where he currently lectures in the Department of Modern Foreign Languages. He has held several research fellowships that include a freestanding postdoctoral fellowship funded by the NRIF, the African Humanities Program by the American Council for the Learned Societies, the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, ISOLOMSO Fellowship, as well as a virtual fellowship at the Leeds University Center for African Studies. He sits on a number of editorial boards that include the Journal of Literary Studies, Imbizo, International Journal of African Literary and Comparative Studies, the Canadian Journal of African Studies, the Nordic Journal of African Studies, and also the Governing Intimacies in the Global South book series at Manchester University Press. He is the current French book review editor of the Canadian Journal of African Studies and the assistant editor of the South African Journal of African Languages. From 2020 to 2022, he served as the co-convener of the Queer African Studies Association. He was the 2021 Mary Kingsley Zokonis Distinguished Lecturer of the Royal African Society and African Studies Association UK. He holds a C1 NRIF rating and is a current fellow of the DHET Future Professors Programs. We are so grateful for his presence today. Please join me to give a very warm welcome to Dr. GIBSON NCUBE.
Good morning to you all. Am I loud enough? Yes. Thank you so much for this opportunity to come and speak about my book. It's the first launch of this book, and I'm so excited and also very nervous at the same time. So thank you very much to the SARChl chair, Prof. Zethu Matebeni, and also thank you to the Transformation Office in the College of Human Sciences at Unisa. Thank you so much, Dr. Vuyo. And also thank you very much to everyone who is here in presence and also virtually. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to talk about how this book came to being and also outline the main questions that I deal with in the book and also talk a bit about the structure of this book. So originally, I attended a manuscript development workshop in Nigeria. I think it was in 2018 or 19, where I pitched the idea of this book to the African Humanities Program book series at NISC. And the editors found it interesting, and I began working on it from then. I think I wrote this book in different places, in different countries, different spaces, but mostly at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, where I was holding a ISOLOMSO fellowship. So I had 2 residences at Stellenbosch and a third residence in the US just as COVID was starting. And I was locked away in a room in the US for 4 or 5 months working on this manuscript. So some of the questions that I try to grapple with in this book are: what does it mean to make queer African bodies visible, legible, and intelligible in sociocultural contexts where they are often rendered invisible? And what does it mean to think about the specificities of queer African bodies to mark their vulnerability and disposability without further marginalizing them? And what does it mean to consider the skin as an expressive screen on a continent where skin is already so overdetermined? So as I thought through these questions, I was interested in offering a nuanced reading of a selection of films from different parts of the continent. And in so doing, I sought to make two main interventions. And the first was to think about what we can learn from reading the body on television screens, on movie screens. And I considered the body as sort of text, which comes with stories, with histories. And looking at these bodies on screen tells us so much, especially in context on the continent where queer bodies are often silenced and exist in invisibility. So that was the first intervention that I sought to make. And the second intervention that I sought to make was to think of what could happen when we consider films from different parts of the continent, because I think the field of African studies is often very divided, especially along the North Africa and Sub-Saharan divide. So what I did in this book is to read films from these different parts of the continent together with each other, against each other, and I was interested in what is achieved by rubbing these films together, if I can use Kiguro Macharya's terminology. So in terms of the structure of this book, it's divided into four main chapters. And in each chapter, I try to look at different bodies that are made visible by different parts or in different parts of the continent. So the first two chapters focus on North Africa. And the first chapter looks at the Maghreb, the three countries of the Maghreb, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. And I look at films like The Salvation Army by Abdel Attaya, a film like Al Dowaha by Raja Amari, and the bodies that are made, that come out from this body of films are what I call silent or silenced bodies, because these are bodies that exist but do not say anything. And what I found interesting about these films is the way there was so much silence, literally, yet very yawning gaps. And the queer characters in these films said very little to nothing. So I was interested in thinking of what these silenced bodies said on the screen, how these queer bodies related to other bodies, queer and not queer, and especially what the skin allows us to do in this particular region of North Africa, where queerness often is implicated in very, how do I put it, in power dynamics, where queerness is only defined through the sexual act, about who is penetrating and who is being penetrated. And what the skin does in these films, for example, The Salvation Army, is that we only see the skin of the vulnerable queer character, whilst the skins of the penetrating characters who do not identify as queer remain covered. So their bodies remain completely covered in all sins, whilst the penetrated character, their body is nude. We see their skin. And this, I think, speaks to the vulnerability of queer bodies in these films from the Maghreb. So in the second chapter, I look at what I call ambivalent queer bodies in Egyptian films. And I think the films from Egypt offer an interesting contrast of queerness in North Africa. because obviously Egypt, compared to the French-speaking world of North Africa, has a different colonial history, which comes with its own different baggages. And unlike the bodies that we see in the Maghreb, the bodies in Egyptian films speak. However, they remain very ambivalent. And this ambivalence, I think, is a side of thinking through and negotiating the deep-seated ambivalence and anxiety which result from the tension between different notions such as tradition, modernity, religion, and also politics. So in the last two chapters, I moved to sub-Saharan Africa, and in the third chapter, I look at films from East Africa, films from Kenya and Uganda, films like I Am Samuel, um, The Pearl of Africa, and also Rafiki. And the kinds of bodies that come out from East African films are what I call legible queer and trans bodies. So unlike the bodies that we have seen in North Africa, I consider the bodies from sub-Saharan Africa very legible because in addition to being able to speak and to articulate their queerness, they can also be seen very visibly on the screen. So if you look at a film like Rafiki, which tells the story of two lesbian young women, the ambiance takes us to a very urban city in Kenya, and we see how these young ladies negotiate the space of urban Kenya, contemporary urban Kenya. Whilst a film like I'm Samuel gives us a different take of queerness in Africa by locating the characters in a very rural space, showing that queerness is not only limited to urban spaces, but that queer is also possible even in the rural spaces, which are considered in many instances very traditional and very entrenched in religious and cultural practices. What I found interesting, for example, in a film like I'm Samuel, is how queerness is acted, it's performed, and it's not spoken about. So the main character is a young man who's unable to come out to his parents, and by coming out, I'm talking of the very Western sense of the term of being able to tell one's family or friends that one is queer. But what we see is the character performing their coming out to their parents. So although they originally do not accept their son, I think the final scene in this film is very telling of how the parents accept their son. So what they do in this family is that every evening they pray, and in this prayer they call out the names of the different members of the family. So in this final scene, um, Samuel's name and his partner Alex both hold out in this very sacred and intimate moment of prayer, which I think speaks to how, although his parents were struggling to come to terms, they accept their son and they accept his lifestyle and they also accept his partner. So in the final chapter, which I call Intersectional Queer Bodies, I look at a few films from South Africa. So I look at films like Hingleba by John Grove, Oliver Hermanus's Morphe, The World and Scene by Shamim Sarif, and also Catherine Stewart's While You Weren't Looking. So what I try to do in these four films is to look at the presentation of queer characters from apartheid to post-apartheid periods. And what I use as a central theory in this chapter is Kali Kutsia's thinking on the skin as as a way of reading relations in South Africa. And I bring this idea into conversation with what Pano Ratele terms the skinning, which refers to how South African people view each other, judge each other based on their skin color and their skin complexion as well. So I examine in this final chapter how race, class, gender, and queerness rub against each other and the kinds of anxieties this friction engenders. So given South Africa's history of race relations, my interest in this chapter was on how queer bodies from different races are queered. And my focus was also on how race is related to violence in the construction of queer identities and in shaping how queer lived experiences are imagined. So at the heart of this book was a close attention to queer lived experiences and an instance that queer bodies are texts that can be read as discursive and textualized sociocultural phenomena. As I maneuvered through a broad range of films, I also zoomed in on the specific questions about how queer bodies can navigate different forms of social silence, how they fluctuate between visibility and invisibility, how they make sense and experience space, embodiment, and relationality, how they form community, and also how they navigate religious and socio-cultural norms and expectations. So yeah, I think in brief, that is a presentation of my book. And again, I'm so happy to have gotten this opportunity to speak about my book and to also discuss it in a few minutes, because I think such spaces on the continent are very rare. So I was supposed to have a roundtable of this book at a conference, I think in August in Uganda. But last week I received like an email from the organizer saying that it is now impossible because discussing queer issues in Uganda is now literally a crime. So such spaces are not possible in other parts of the continent, and I do not take that for granted. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that insightful presentation and introduction into this text. We are going to move very swiftly to the second part, which is the part that I'm quite excited about, which is the conversation that emerges from about this book and about the themes that emerge. There's so much that you've given us to think about. And I think one of the biggest interventions that this book makes is being able to draw or to minimize that gap that exists between northern and the southern hemisphere, in the southern Africa. You know, there's always this tension of when we speak about Africa, we don't speak about Africa in its entirety, and the your ability to bring these worlds in a in such a text is an incredible contribution, and that is one of the greatest things that I'm excited about the book. I'd like to take a moment now to ask our panelist, who will be in conversation with Prof this morning, to join me on the stage. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Dr. Princess Sibanda. Dr. Princess Sibanda is a postdoctoral fellow in the SARChl Chair for Genders, Sexualities, and Queer Studies at the University of the Fort Hare. We have Mr. Lesego Rampele. Mr. Lesego Rampele is a clinical psychologist and doctoral scholar at the University of South Africa. And then finally, as part of this panel today is Dr. Precious Simba. Dr. Precious Simba is in the Department of Education within at the Stellenbosch University. Welcome to Dr. Simba. I am going to move from where I am, colleagues, to join them in the hot seats so we can start this interesting conversation. Thank you so much. Where do you have laptops? No, very serious people. Wow. Very serious people of the South, our panelists. And there's the author without even a laptop. Like, ni serious, man. You. Hi again. Again, I'm very, very grateful. I don't know if you can see me, everybody in the venue. I hope I'm visible. And I would like to start by offering our panelists an opportunity to just speak through some of the themes that emerged and what was telling and what was compelling about the book for them as we start to engage in this conversation this morning. So I'll start from my left-hand side with you, Precious. Oh, no, Princess, sorry, my Kolo, you. It's this friendship.
That's okay. I think my initial response to the book would be in form of a poem. This poem was written while I was engaging with gay youths in Zimbabwe in an artistic intervention. And I guess it speaks to body as text. Embodied knowledges as knowledges that are important. It is entitled, You Are My Mother, Africa. Africa, you are my mother. For 9 months, I was held within your interior. I fed off your stomach. I drank off your intestines. I lived on your breath. I was fearfully, wonderfully, and beautifully formed within your womb, Africa. In you, I danced. In you, I dined. I slept. I played. I cried. I laughed. According to your heartbeat, Africa. I do not remember you to be a dog, nor do I remember you to be a pig. Therefore, I can never be a dog. I do not remember your roots to be Pluto, Mars, nor Jupiter. How then do I become alien Africa? You are the blood that runs through my veins. I was born of your seed, and I bear your name, Africa. You are my mother, Africa. I will not allow you to disown me. Rather, you take me back to your womb, where you proudly associated yourself with me. Never for a day thinking of disowning me, but praying day and night that I do not die before you release me into this world. Why disown your own now, Africa? Why hate your own now, Africa? Why fear your own now, Africa? Why kill your own now, Africa? You are my mother, Africa. I'm the fruit of your seed, watered to growth by your blood. My name is Queer. My surname is Africa. I'll leave it there for now.
The bar is quite high. So suddenly I lose all my words. But I think when I read the book, first of all, first thing that came to mind was the body, how the body speaks and how it doesn't speak, and what is assumed always about the body in its context, the different context within Africa, and thinking about the regions and what we often privilege. I think for the first time, I had to think about North Africa, and I grappled, and it wasn't easy. But I also understood that the specificities that are created by these regions, and in terms of how then queer comes into being, and looking at the body as text, as a side, but it's also a side within a side. And then how do we make sense of it? And those are some of the questions that came to mind.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. That's a very high bar that you've set, Dr. Swanda. I feel like if I was a musician, or something, you know. Um, I really enjoyed the book, but I had certain questions and certain tensions that it brought out in me. But perhaps as academics, one of the things that we do, because we are trained in particular ways, we always come to such work through our disciplinary practice. So, as somebody who's in the Faculty of Education, the first thing that jumped out of the book for me was issues of reading, on translation, on interpretation, and legibility. And for me, when we start to think of bodies as text, then text always evokes the need for reading. And how do we read? But before I went to how do we read, is how are queer experiences captured in film? Because as much as we celebrate when queer experiences are captured in film, we are also aware that what we see off the screen is often a processed product. It has been sifted through the director's lenses, through the screenwriters. So what we're reading is a processed product of reality, right? So that was the first take for me. In all of these films, I started to, and I have to really appreciate you, Doc, for bringing such a variety of films that I wouldn't have thought of bringing conversation with each other. And in so doing, allowing us to explore different parts of Africa. And I think that is something that is very incredible about the book. But for me, the first question was how close, as we read these narratives, how much of this has been sifted? How much of this has been edited? How much of this has been quote unquote performed? And how much of reality remains in the text that we still read? And so that was the first thing that I started to think about. And um, as I thought about that, I was thinking about W.B. Du Bois' point about looking at the precarity of looking at one's self through the eyes of others. So as you contend with queer narratives being performed by others, having your own story being told by others, and so you always want to see how close to reality is it, right? Um, and closely to that, now coming to the issue of reading and legibility, I thought of the idea of how Barthes talks about how the author dies once the text has been completed. What does that mean about the reception of such films? Because once the text has been put out, the author essentially dies, right? And in order for us to read, there's almost like, and Barthes alludes to this, the need for the author to die, the need for that queer body to die in order for the text to live. So, what does that mean for queer experiences? Um, there was a quotation here where he talks about as soon as the fact is narrated, no longer with a view of acting directly on reality, but intransitively. That is to say, finally, outside of any function other than that of the very practice of the symbol itself, this disconnection occurs. The voice loses its origin, right? And if the origin is in the queer, what does that mean about the text that then travels through film and travels across Africa and is interpreted in various ways, sometimes in violent ways, as we saw to responses to some of these films like Rafiki, like Ingleba. That is an instance of the author dying, because on the one hand, we are celebrating queer experiences, and as the book alludes to, but the author has died. And when the text is now read in other places, it is read and translated in different ways. So we have to ask of ourselves, what of legibility? What of how legible are these bodies? Do we read them all the same? Or once it begins to travel, it takes on a life of its own? I think that was quite a bit.
so we can kind of manage the process. Thank you very much to our panelists for those nuggets. And from there, we start to contend with the idea of the construction of reality and the mediation of reality and how film mediates our reality and ability how and how it's legible. Thank you. And how it's legible and if we are all reading them in the same way. Um, and particularly this idea of body. Can I just have that? Thank you. I think central to this conversation before, we look at the audience, you know, one of the major things that emerges from this book is the idea of the body. And what body is this? What kind of body? Who embodies it? Body as text. So it would be quite interesting to just have some thoughts on the queer body and this construction of the queer body and this representation of the queer body, because we get excited when we see representation because of the multitude of important reasons that it must be there. Um, let's Whose body is this and what does this body do? Any thoughts?
Okay, but before I get to that, I just wanted to speak about also the role of fiction in building imagination. To say that sometimes it might be maybe far off, but not too far off. And that kind of fiction plays a role in terms of imagining futures. And yeah, the I think the central tenet in this book for me is the idea of the body as text, the queer body as text can be read in the context within which we are writing, in the context that we're living in. You'll find that a lot of spoken text has been used, especially by statesmen, to denounce the queer body as illegitimate, as deviant, as disobedient. But we have the bodies, speaking against that kind of spoken text through embodied language. So, if, for example, Mugabe says at the UN summit that we're not gay in Africa, and the queer bodies are moving around the streets every day, the streets of Africa. That is the body saying in itself that we are here, we exist, and this myth or this lie is actually a lie. So there's this important thing about the body resisting, the body challenging other forms of knowledge that we've been told to be privileged forms of knowledge. So how do we look at I think one thing that I appreciate about the book is to center the queer body, which has been marginalized, it's been designated for the margins, for the peripheries, and now it's taking center stage. And of course, delving into film as text as well, that can be read, that can be interpreted. But even when the queer body is on screen before they even speak, their body speaks to say, I'm here. So that is quite important in terms of what Dr. Gibson says, the visual archive. What visual archive are we building? And that visual archive is being built by the body before it gets on the screen. Just the body in itself as a queer body, this deviant body, this body that does not follow the rules or the world order. And so this body is supposed to be at the margins. But then I think what this book does is to bring it to the center by also kind of figuring out how film as a media technique or as a visual text kind of portrays these bodies. So, yeah.
I think just picking up from that, in terms of a text, I think I want us to think about what is written on the body, but also what is written out of the body. And I think in film, we also see in terms of how the queer body is presented. what is it meant to enact, the kind of feelings in the audience. What is the message that is told? It is important that queer bodies are represented, but it's also how they are represented in terms of what is the motive of the author. And I think Professor Gibson, talks a lot about that around the book in terms of how these films portray these bodies, these queer bodies. And because we privilege sight over what people say, the minute we see that body, we're already reading it, that is a queer body in terms of what it's doing or not doing. And in that, we also challenged in terms of, when you look at North Africa and the sub-Saharan, in terms of it's what these bodies are doing. That in the sub-Saharan, you see how this body, they're able to talk in terms of verbalize, but there it is what is done also in certain spaces. And that makes it, that also brings us that in terms of queerness, that heterogeneity that is in queerness, that how it comes about, it's different in different areas, and we cannot homogenize it. And that it's important to look at all these specificities also in the text.
Thank you. I think I agree with um, um, Princess and Lesejo, in that when we're reading the body as text and what the book presents, in 2023, I was quite excited when I read it to think of the diversities that we see in the bodies that are presented in these films, right? So these bodies are not telling the same story. They're not telling the usual story. They're not telling a stereotypical story. Even where they are silenced or ambivalent, they're still telling a story, but the stories are different and they add texture to the queer experience across Africa. And for me, I found that to be quite interesting to say in 2023, well, the book came out last year, but I still find it a marvel to see bodies, queer bodies that tell such diverse stories. It's because we haven't been given an opportunity to read such texts, to read such bodies, to experience such bodies off the screen. And I think the stories that they tell and the texts that they are giving us are multi-textured, but very, very important. And it speaks to the idea and the importance of diversity. That desire is textured. That desire is multi-level. Desire is not only led by genitalia. For me, that was a marvel. Even where some of the stories become very stereotypical, but still they are going against many grains of what we have come to be told is queer desire. So I thought that was an important contribution that the book did in bringing these films together in this way. Again, we keep going back to, and I think Leseho, you talked about this as well. We keep going back to this idea of how Dr. Ncube, you brought stories from across the continent, because what we have come to know as queer experiences, most of the times, or queer films, most of the times we're telling South African stories. Most of the times. So, what does it mean to be queer and Mozambican? To be queer, what does the queer experience look like in rural Angola? Is it the same as what it is, say, in Alexander? Is it the same, say, as in Harare? So, in bringing these stories, in these narratives through these bodies, through these films, in this way, I feel this was the genius of the book, because it then pushes us to say, wait a minute, why are we only talking about Southern Africa? Why are we only talking about South Africa? Why are we only talking about Uganda? What is happening in Burkina Faso? What is happening? Now we become curious because these bodies, like Princess is saying, they exist. Their stories are there. So for me, this was quite a marvel. I think this was the marvel of the book as I read it. The way, I'm not sure, maybe you will respond to this, how you came to, I think you do talk about it a little bit in your introduction about the methodology of bringing these stories together. Maybe you can add on to that. Why these particular stories? Why this particular portfolio of films? Because it gives us these different textures of the continent. And as we're imagining queer futures, queer African futures, those futures cannot only be South African because um, it's incredible how South African film has traveled across the continent, but also we must guard against it being the only voice, the only narrative that goes out across the continent. So, as we think about queer African futures, then we need to ask ourselves who's in the room and who's not in the room. And I think that's what the book prompts us to do.
Let me respond to some of the
Okay.
questions around the body, um, the portfolio of films and its resonance for making the contribution that the book does in bridging that particular gap.
Okay. To begin with, I called the queer bodies I was examining texts because what I'd done before I analyzed the films was to watch them, obviously. And some of these films were in languages that I do not speak or understand. For example, a film like Rafiki is almost completely in Swahili, which I don't speak. And I tried to watch the film without the subtitles that you get on Showmax. And it was interesting to understand the story, even without understanding what these bodies were saying to each other. And it's from this experience of reading such films, like Arabic films that are shot completely in Arabic, and then watching them without the subtitles, to understand the stories that these bodies are articulating through the way they embody their queerness, in the way they position themselves in different spaces. So I found this very interesting, and that you're able to read the body without having to understand what, as Princess said, the body says verbally. So I think what I wanted to do was to privilege the body itself as a site of creating knowledge about queer lived experiences. And then in terms of the corpus of films that I work with in this book, I think one of the main issues was accessibility of the films. So although you can get like a trailer on YouTube, actually being able to get a copy of the film was very difficult. So the South African films were very easy to access, obviously, but films from North Africa, from West Africa as well, were difficult to access. So this reduced the number of films that I could access. And funny enough, the films that I work with, I got to watch because I had traveled to the US, where they had copies of the films, which I was not able to readily get access to on the continent. So I think this also speaks to how we produce knowledge on the continent and how we do not have access to some of these cultural productions that we want to work with. So there might be an interest to work on on text from Burkina Faso, from Cote d'Ivoire, but without access, it's difficult. And yeah, it's very sad at the same time that these texts are readily available in the global north and that they circulate very easily in the global north. So if you look at some of these films, they've won several like awards different film festivals across the global north, whilst they remain unwatched on the continent. And if I go back to Precious's question on the author dying, I think viewers on the African continent refuse for the author to die. If you take, for example, Inleba, people were very personal with the actors and the directors of this film and what they did in this film, more than just looking at the film as a text on its own and understanding what the text was trying to say. So I think there was a refusal to let the text be on its own, to let the directors and the actors die, well, literally, not literally, but die symbolically for the text to come alive, to have its full potential.
Thank you for that, Doc. It leads me to question then, especially if most of the films have been shown at film festivals and they're not necessarily mainstream. Often the kind of audiences that that film festivals attract are mostly people that almost like preaching to the converted. And oftentimes these films are also funded by entities within the global north. And as such, you see, they also have ownership of the product and wondering again, what kind of control, who controls the narrative? Is the queer body living its life or is living the life of those who fund? It's something that we have in applied theater as well to say, if a donor says, I want you to talk about sexuality, but I want you to talk about it in this way, in the frame that they understand it. So I'm wondering with these films, especially those that have been shown at film festivals, the funding, the donor funding, what effects or impact it has on the telling of the stories. Do we just have queer bodies on screen that are telling the stories of others, as Precious has alluded to, or that are living the lives of others other than theirs? And just to also say that with South Africa, when you go to South Africa, you analyze such soaps as Generations, which is more mainstream. So again, to think about queer themed film and African films that have queer subjects in them, like the distinctions there. Yeah, something that I think would love for you to just speak to.
So I think that's a question I think about in the introduction, like what passes as an African film? Is it the nationality of the director? Is it the cast? Is it the theme of the film? Is it the funding of the film as well? How do we define an African film? So I think in some of the films like The Pearl of Africa, which was about queer lived experiences in Africa, it was directed by a Swedish director. I think questions were raised on, for example, the authenticity of the depiction that's offered, and also like what kinds of audiences are imagined or targeted by these films. Are these films made for audiences on the continent, or are they made for circulation outside of the continent? And if that is the case, what then does that mean about such representations? And what do they force us to think in terms of the representations that these films try to offer?
Okay. I wanted to ask you something, leading from the point you talked about accessibility, because one of the things that film does is that it allows for us to build one imagination, like you talked about, and we keep talking about queer African futures. But if the films are not seculated. And I think, Dr. Weir, you talked about that your interest as a transformation office in queer issues is the humanizing aspect, because you have concerns in how certain bodies are dehumanized. And if film is an opportunity to humanize different bodies, and yet these films do not have the kind of circulation that we would want them to have, what then does it say about queer African futures? Perhaps this is a question for you and for Princess, because I know you've recently written a paper around then the role, the subversive role of social media. But at a time where in Africa to be queer is in many parts is to be persona non grata, our experiences and existences and our citizenship is continuously being erased. And we look to such works as some of the films that you have included in your book to humanize queer bodies, to humanize queer people across the continent, to say these are people who fall in love like everybody else. These are people who go to work and do everyday things, you know. But if there's no circulation, then what then does it say about building Pan-African queer futures? Is film still the medium? And this is for you, Princess and Gibson.
Yeah, I think in an article that we just worked on together, I think one of the arguments that we make is that social media, I think, has a greater potential in circulating narratives about queer lived experiences on the continent than feature films that are supposed to be shown in movie houses where no one hardly goes anymore, or show on platforms like Showmax and Netflix, which many people can't afford on the continent. So I think the different visual cultures that have more potential in circulating wider than feature films, I think.
Yeah. So I think what also this book does is to say to us, look, there's alternative text to read. So what it does is to sort of like redirect us to other forms of text. And what we have, for example, on TikTok, TikTok has these affordances where you can become your own director, your own producer, shoot your thing and circulate it immediately, and anyone can access it just after you have shot it. So it's a kind of film, I think, that has moved because of obviously technological advancement. But film is the starting point to say, look at film as text, and then think of other ways of reading or other forms of text that you can read and think then around queer imagination. So I think this is a good starting point. So film is the starting point to say we can maybe fictionalize or render visible the queer body, because in mainstream media, especially in Africa, I think we have limited visibility. I can think, for Zimbabwe example, we have never had something like Generations, right? So to have these films is a good starting point to say this is text that we can read, that we can see the queer body living its life. And then now we have other forms of text like TikTok, Instagram, and so forth.
I just want to come in there in terms of other forms of platforms that are used. And I think this talks to resistance in terms of how does then resistance look like in different countries, and in terms of how queer bodies come into space, and the sense of agency that I will tell also my story in a different platform in my own terms, but within constraints already in terms of funding, that there's a certain narrative. But in other platforms, you see also that the queer body continues to be agent and resistance doesn't always look like what we know in terms of being on the streets. It's also just living. Resistance looks like just a being, just moving around. It's a form of resistance in terms of how then queer bodies move around. And I think in terms of if we look at the future of queerness in Africa, we need to look at perhaps stop privileging also in terms of looking into certain spaces which are centered like film, but in everyday life that people in terms of how they live, those simple things, those movements are forms of resistance that we need to start talking about. And Professor also talk about it in the book in terms of that resistance comes in many forms, and we need to start looking at that and teasing it out.
Yeah.
I want to throw it back a bit.
Okay.
And I know that we've spoken, we've moved from understanding or looking at films as the only text or the only way in which we can, or a particular tactile way that we can see representation, to looking at social media as also an area or a space. But there's something that you spoke about, Precious. This idea of Pan-Africanist. Um, where do we see them? Particularly if we take film as a stepping stone. Where do we see them, and how do we see their construction and their development and their emergence? I think what Prof. Gube does in this book is that he's able to present a more holistic view. We've spoken and labored at length about how, there's these stratifications and what is accessible. But in imagining these Pan-Africanist queer futures, where do we put the media text as a possibility for imagining?
Thank you, Melissa. I would think we see them in the everyday. Because when we're looking at even Pan-Africanist modes of performance, African paradigm in particular, there is not much of a distance or difference between lived reality and what we package as performance. So I would think it's in the everyday. And I guess the screen now the world becomes the stage where queer bodies are interacting every day in everyday spaces. And perhaps for me, that is the emerging kind of archive. In this everyday, like I said earlier, TikTok is one of the best ways of seeing how this everyday is happening, how people interact in the everyday when they shoot their videos in their personal spaces. So it is in the everyday, and TikTok is one such space.
I would say that I agree on the one part. I agree that Pan-African futures exist where queer bodies exist, because in their very existence is a protest to the often violent forms of erasure that are currently ongoing throughout Africa. So the very fact that there are queer people that continue to live across the continent is a protest on its own. But that is not enough. I think there is more concerted effort that is needed to protect those futures. I have seen coordinated efforts across the continent and beyond in through the African diaspora. For example, I remember when the bill in Uganda was about to be passed, we saw members of Kaleidoscope, UK Black Pride, for example. They had protests in London. There were protests across Europe. Different people within the diaspora that are speaking back to the continent. And I think these voices are all important, because then we must hold our governments accountable, because queer bodies will continue to exist, but given the current trajectory, they will exist under a lot of strain and violence, as we're seeing in Uganda, as we're seeing in across the continent. We're seeing in Nigeria, for example. We're seeing it in Zimbabwe. We're seeing that unless we take concerted efforts to institutionalize, to legalize protections, then these futures that we speak of will exist at a conceptual level and will not be realized by everyday people. So yes, on the one hand, I do agree. Where queer people exist, the protest continues to live. But we have to find ways to build, I think, legal protections across the continent. It cannot just be in speech, it cannot just be in rhetoric. We have to find ways to protect queer bodies across the continent. And this is what will secure queer African futures, I believe.
I think I just want to add to that. I think it's important in terms of changing laws, but it's also important to change perception in terms of how then does it look like on the ground. And we've got a beautiful constitution in South Africa, but South Africa also is one of most homophobic countries in terms of, if you look at in terms of what is happening. But in terms of the constitution, it's different. But what happens on the ground is something else, and it also relates to issues such as race, class, issues that have already been raised. That who is then privileged, who's the queer that is protected. So also in theorizing, we also need to look at what is possible on the ground. And also, if we think about visibility without protection is also problematic. And I think a lot of queer people have said it on the ground.
I think that we have had an earful, but I was just quite particularly interested in the role of cultural productions in that resistance. And in the role of cultural productions such as film, such as music, such as text, such as dramatic performance, as ways in which queer bodies are able to be read and to be seen and to occupy space and to resist. So I was hoping to hear your thoughts as we close this conversation, particularly on, Prof. Ngube has provided us a book that allows us to imagine and to see how film works as a production, a cultural production that allows for representation of queer bodies and and how queer bodies not only exist, but they are read as to perform existence in different aspects or in different localities and geographies across the African continent. Where do we see the role of these cultural products in imagining these Pan-Africanist queer futures? Those might be my last my requests for your thoughts in this discussion before we open up to the floor. And we'll ask you to close off with those thoughts as well, Prof. So what is the role of these
Can I say something?
cultural products?
I think Princess will speak much more clearly on this one, but I wanted to give an example, maybe an anecdote. The height of Mugabeism, at the height of Mugabeism, where at every opportunity that he was given, he was speaking against these gays and clearing them. I think one time he declared them persona non grata. All across Zimbabwe, even in the most rural and remote parts of the country, people had satellite dishes and people were watching Generations. And at that time, that's when I believe Isidingo, Generations, had clearly queer characters. So every day at 8 p.m. and I think 6 p.m. or something like that, every day in all of these households, people are watching queer characters. And I thought, how subversive is that? How powerful is that? That even in this space where someone takes a powerful podium, such as the presidency, to erase certain people out of the nation's citizenry, and yet every day families sit down and these are the experiences that come through their television. So you were talking about the role of cultural production. I just think that is an incredibly powerful and subversive way that film, in its various formats, can seep into the homes. And I know Christian conservative, religious conservatives will read this as in one way, this seeping in, this subversive um, aspect of film or any cultural productions. They will read it differently, but I read it as a powerful way of creating counter narratives.
I think in terms of cultures, it's one aspect that is complex. One, in Africa, culture is very important, but culture also evolved, right? But there's also cultural production in media, and then looking at culture in all those different levels, and also in how culture, embraces queerness or shuns queerness, or how it's portrayed, at least in certain areas. And in terms of film, in terms of how then film, the culture that is created within media, in terms of then how do we think of queerness, or how then do queer people take that agency to be at the center. And I also like what you spoke about in terms of that subversiveness, in terms of even though queer people might be portrayed in a certain way, but it remains in people's heads, whether they like it or not. It sips into those spaces, into different spaces, and then for me that's also quite important.
So for me, two things stand out when it comes to cultural production, especially in the continent. First is the efficacy of cultural production in steering conversations around queerness and Africanness. First being the fact that I alluded to the idea that there's no detachment between lived reality or lived experience and performance. So what it means is that it's already a vernacular. It's already part of our language. It's already a popular kind of expression that is not detached from our everyday. So we are able to then read, and we're also able to perform it without difficulty. So it becomes a very important medium in terms of steering conversations that pertain to Africa and sexualities, gender, and queer studies being one of them. And then in terms of sort of the role, one of the major roles of cultural production is the idea of seeing or rendering visible and therefore normalizing. The more you see a queer body on the screen, it ceases to be alien, it ceases to be something that is not familiar. And when it becomes normal, then it becomes humanized. So I think that is one of the major roles of cultural production, especially in the context that we're in.
Would like to share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to say legal protections are important. what's more important is to change mentalities. And I don't think legal protections have the capacity to change the way people think. Because, for example, South Africa has a beautiful constitution. But at the same time, South Africa has the highest levels of corrective rape in the world. It doesn't make sense because this beautiful constitution doesn't trickle down to the everyday lives of people, how they relate to each other. So, which is where I think cultural productions like films, like literature, um, foster conversations, very important conversations at very basic and very human levels. I can give a very personal example. A gay couple moved in like next door my parents' house in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. And my mom is a very religious woman and she wasn't very comfortable at the beginning. But I think having to engage with queer bodies in soapies, which she loves so much on a daily basis, I think has slowly changed the way she considers her neighbors. And she's currently, well, she considers them her children as well and buys them gifts on their birthdays, on Christmas. So I think cultural productions have way potency than legal protections can offer for queer people in Africa, I think.
Thank you so much. I will open up this conversation to the floor. I will ask No Gender to manage the roving mic for us, for those who'd like to ask our author any of the panelist questions that might have emerged from this conversation and discussion, or just some nuggets of thought um, around what we've spoken about: cultural production, film, the representation of queer bodies in film. I'll hand over to the floor. Do we have some hands?
Um, thanks, Chair, and thanks, Gibson, for your book. My questions are directed at Gibson, largely. The first question is, when we look at body as a text, and of course we cannot afford to avoid issues around intertextuality and polysemy being read in different ways. And when you look at them, when you look at the African setting, which is largely communal, right? And then you have to question who has the final reading of the body, as it were? Who has the final making sense of one's sexuality, right? Because when you look at issues around corrective rape and all these kinds of things, it's sort of patriarchy trying to assert itself in a certain direction, or the community trying to impose a certain sexuality on that resisting body, right? And then you go on to talk about Ubuntu, we are because I am because we are and stuff. Therefore, can I be sexually, and while the rest of you are not? And the other question is about consumption patterns, and you rightly raise it that in South Africa there is access to these films, even though the conversations that ensue after that are quite discordant, right? And I consider discordance or discord is a valued part of our conversations, because it gives us these different views and people's thoughts. But how do you explain the lack of consumption of these films when you go up north, as it were? And what do we make of it that they're actually available and consumed in the global north? Are they sort of produced for film awards only, or they are produced for educative and also entertainment values within the context that they are produced. And also the other discordant part that you raised it in one of your talks in Stellenbosch, and it's a well-known fact that when Christianity comes and colonialism comes to Africa, homosexuality, queerness are criminalized, right? But now the circle is coming back. It would seem like the global north is very much vocal about the lack of rights for queer and homosexuals in the global south. And how do you sort of explain that sort of secular return of things, as it were? Thanks.
Um, Thank you for your discussion. It was quite interesting. I was thinking about the fact that a lot of the films you address are urban centered, except for I Am Samuel and Inleva. I mean, I've watched like a few other African queer films, but going to these two and the other ones that were maybe, I'm trying to think particularities here because we talk about queer as umbrella, but also there are these very particular experiences, and the films that you do address are about either queer men or homosexual men. I'm not sure about the labels they use. And I read a thing about Neba and construction of masculinities, this idea of the new South African man. And if you think of how it starts with this young man being sent off to be masculinized, basically. So I'm hoping that I will make sense here, but there is something about rural settings and particular kinds of masculinity, and the fact that we see these also gay men in rural settings, and there's also not necessarily acceptance, but also a queering of that space, but from a very muscular point of view. So I guess I want maybe your thoughts on what it means, uh, how we can maybe understand queer masculinities themselves, and the fact that I don't think I have seen trans, maybe queer women in similar settings or accepted in the same way. Does it make sense, my question? Something about masculinity and this cultural context, and maybe the acceptance of or the ability for maybe queer men to take up those spaces, and or even the desire to go back to those spaces because of how masculinity is constructed in those spaces. Yeah. I hope it makes sense.
Greetings, everyone. I'd like to thank the panel for such an enriching discussion. So the question that I have is a little bit related to a question that was asked earlier. The issue of, and then what concerns me is the issue of cultural production in terms of queer films, right? Remember, there is a particular identity formation in terms of cultural production, in as far as queer people are concerned. And what I'm basically trying to say is that when you've got a particular queer film, you've got a young person who's trying to make sense of their sexual orientation, and the first thing that they are able to relate to is a particular film. And so there's the issue of textual hegemony, right? That constructs particular queer that constructs particular ways of being for queer people, right? And like I said, one of my concerns is how heterosexism, even within queer communities, have to a certain heterosexism have constructed even the very same queer relationships, within the binary feminine and the masculine, that goes on. So I guess my biggest question is then, in case of the production of films that actually take place, are they rich enough to be able to cater, adequately for queer identities, different queer identities that actually exist within the African landscape in terms of how films are produced, right? The second question, or the second thing that I wanted to raise, was the issue of there being a shift, where Christianity is very colonial. Christianity comes with this particular colonial enterprise, and then you see the North now taking a different stance on this issue. Right? And one of the things that has been concerning for me about that, or at least my 2 cents that I can add to that, is the fact that you are sitting with a country that has not really dealt with colonialism to the absolute core, and you have got a body of Africans who are starting to become conscious about the effects of colonialism. And now, because the very same West now, the very same West that demonized queerness and now comes and says queerness is wrong, to a certain extent, there becomes a resistance, not maybe against queerness, but against colonialism, but against the effects of colonialism to the detriment of queer people. So yeah, that's the 2 cents and the question that I wanted to ask. So, thank you.
There's one more question.
No, we'll take one more last round. Let's just take these questions to the queue. We'll do another round.
Thank you very much, Prof. Shepherd, for your questions. On the question on who has the final reading of these queer bodies and films, especially considering that the viewing of such films takes place in very communal settings, I think it might boil down to individuals making their own informed decisions on what they think of the different representations of these bodies. And on the Discord that exists, I think the fact that you have these different voices about queerness in Africa is important, I think, to have this choir of different voices registering different things about queer existence on the continent. And yeah, the question of this full circle of Christianity now coming back to be used to talk about the lack of rights on the continent is, I think, is a difficult question. Like if you consider the case of Uganda, where it's the conservative churches from the US that had been backing the anti-homosexuality act. So Christianity, I think, imported homophobia into the continent. And then right now, the same Christianity is being used to fan more homophobia, I think, on the continent. And the question of masculinities, I think if you look at the film like Ingleba, how this role space is a hyper masculine space where young men are supposed to come and become real men, but how this fails, I think, dismally in the film, because you've got men who refuse to embody a specific way of being masculine, of being hyper masculine, and how you have men who are grappling, I think, with the question of what is being a man. Is being a man just simply having a penis, or simply going to the mountain and having one's foreskin removed? So I think a film like Ingleba pushes us to think of what masculinity is, what it ought to be, and especially what it should not be. And yeah, I think the corpus of films that I work with also push us to think beyond the traditional heteronormative binaries of masculine, feminine, penetrating, penetrated, and to imagine futures in which sexualities and ways of being are freed from those, I think, monochromatic ways of considering human existence, of being.
All right, thank you. I just want to speak to what you raised around colonialism. Just to say, what we are experiencing now, I guess, is the uncovering of the lies that we've been told. I think CB writes about the lies that we've been told, and one of the lies being that Africa is the protagonist of homophobic violence. But I guess this is a well choreographed dance, if I may, that has been curated by the global north, and Africa has just participated. And now we're coming to terms with the fact that, okay, there's a coloniality of gender here, there's a coloniality of even the way we perceive sexualities in Africa. And we see that through bodies like that of Caster Semenya. She was castigated at a global level, right? And it trickled down, right, to Africa. So we know now that this is a creation of the global north that we've participated in. And part of what the book does is to participate in the decolonization process as we write back, speak back, and act back through films to say Africa's position has always sort of like been nuanced. And so I really thought I would respond to that point around the coloniality of gender and sexualities.
We thank you very much for the questions. We're going to take one last round and then we will move on with the program.
Thank you for the opportunity. I don't know if mine is really a question or it's more like, it's like thoughts that I have, and then maybe you can comment on that. But for me personally, I think I don't want to talk about we, because also then I generalize, but to express myself, I'm generalizing. But I think in South Africa, and I'm speaking for me as a white male that grew up under the apartheid regime, that religion was used mostly, or in my experience, the community where I grew up, the church specifically used religion to indoctrinate the white church audience, to put it like that, to think in a certain way about Black people, to indoctrinate white people about, for example, the thing of what is like Black people do not have souls, they are heathens, right? These are the things that was from the pulpit when I was in high school. Okay, just to keep that thought. Now, for me, now it's almost like in South Africa and also some places in Africa and in the world, it's almost like there is no more the whole onslaught against. I'm not saying, although it's almost like it moved from race, specifically in South Africa, to LGBTQ people now. if I look at the media, and I'm now talking specifically of the Afrikaans media, for example, the religion is debated in newspapers. This whole thing about gay people that cannot marry is in the newspapers. But what is also for me a bit of a concern is that as when I grew up and when I started to realize that things are actually not what I was taught and indoctrinated, then I had to unlearn certain things, and which happened to me by reading more and speaking to other people and whatever. Um, but now, for example, in America, there's this whole I don't know what to call it, against, firstly, my opinion, by transgender people in America against women, first of all, and also again, and I mean, lesbian women identify as women. But there's this big, I almost want to say, backlash from transgender people against women because transgender people want to be seen as women, right? So I think that is something that worries me. And something else that worries me is that the whole thing about person now can say I'm a trans female or I'm a trans male, and for therefore I want to participate in sport with women. I identify as female, therefore I can participate in sport with females, although I'm actually biologically a male. And then there was already, and there's incidences of people that want to go to female jails, but they are they are trans female, so they actually male because they haven't transitioned, if I can put it like that. This is a bit of a worrying thing for me because there is currently a lot of backlash by transgender people against women. Now, when I speak about, when I say this with caution because obviously for me, a transgender person at the moment in Uganda is totally ostracized versus a transgender person, say, for example, in New York. So yeah, and I think the comment that you made about the churches that pays for this whole backlash against homosexuality in Uganda, I think it's also a way of um, churches to almost like, I don't want to say they keep people dependent on money, on support for the churches, and then it's almost like they want to. It's an agenda setting, almost like they want to get people to move away from a specific topic by highlighting another topic, something like that. Thank you.
Are those the last questions we have from the floor? We have some questions here as well. Can we just address those? Thank you so much. Okay. There are a few comments that I'd like to just engage with, so we involve our guests who are joining us virtually. They're wonderful comments around an insightful presentation. The body as text. Prof. Mholi has been prompting us to imagine and reimagine bodies. A comment, Prof. from Prof. Madebeni. Hey, we see you.
Very insightful thought from Dr. Precious. The author dies after a text or product circulates as it takes its own life, something to think about. How much of this has been performed on the text we read? This is very insightful. These are just comments. I agree with Dr. Simba. We start wondering about the invisible and silent voices. They remain unwatched and sometimes banned from showing in their country of origin, for example, Rafiki. These are some of the comments from the online space. Jen, I will give you a short opportunity to just ask your question, and then we will hand over um, to to Gibson for his last comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I will be very quick. I think it had been addressed a little bit, but I also wanted to, maybe this is mostly to Princess, since you are um, a person in drama and theater. Is there space for an intentional African queer film space? Because I think, okay, we watch a lot of throughout Africa, a lot of South African film and series and whatever is watched, but there is, even within South Africa, there is no intentional Pan-African queer narrative. And if we are looking at countering the Africanity that has been constructed by the conservatives and whatever, then we need to also have like an intentional narrative of our own that is not, because there are all these silos. We look at film in these particular silos, and it doesn't seem like we are in any way trying to come up with a counter narrative that is queer and Pan African. Thank you.
Are there any comments before we hand over to Gibson about the comments that have come through? The thoughts that were shared?
Okay, I'll just say to Jen, I think the major hindrance has been censorship in most of these African spaces. So the little ways and the like people are forging their path towards reclaiming this African identity is, like I said, TikTok for me is the way at the moment, because people are shooting these narratives in their own spaces without that kind of censorship. So I guess the Pan-African queer narrative, in fact, narratives, because I don't think the Pan-African narrative is not one single thing, but again, it's a convergence of many narratives of queerness. And I think for me, TikTok is the answer for now.
I think in my last comment, I'd say something different. I think as you touched on transness, I think I also want to go back to Gibson, that it's one film that talks about transness, and I also think that at times when we talk about queerness, we problematize queerness. At times, as we just somehow erase the identities that are even that are within that queerness as different, and we privilege certain thoughts over others or certain identities. I think as we're teasing out, it's also important to talk about transness within the African context, the trans subjectivities that exist, and also the different views that exist, and start working around it. And I think that comment, it makes us think a lot in terms of how do we also bring transness to conversation, because at times we might just bring it for the sake of bringing it, without really analyzing or critically engaging. And as we talk about the queerness within even the LGBTI, we know very well that there's still hierarchy that exists, and we need to engage with that. And I think also my last comment relates to legibility in terms of queerness. Even within queerness, some queerness is more privileged than others. And that's something that we need to think about.
Thank you. I think my last comment will be around how in this highly technological world that we live in, issues travel, but we should always take care on how we import issues, particularly how issues play out within the global north. In America, queerness, there's a question that Musangi asks about what does it mean to be African and to be queer? What does it mean to be queer in Africa? I think as much as we engage with the global family on a human level, we should also be mindful that queerness plays out differently within the African context. Within African cosmologies, for example, queerness is envisioned quite differently than it is in the global north. So, what does it mean to be trans in Africa? For example, is an interesting question that I would want to investigate. What does it mean to how do homoerotic desires play out within African realities, for example? Is it as we see it in the global north, or are there pockets within Africa where these things play out differently? And I think when we start to ask ourselves those questions, then we start the process of delinking in our thinking, and that is very, very important. So, for example, thinking about what does it mean to be queer in Africa, what do homoerotic desires look like? What does it mean for men at a football match here in South Africa to embrace and kiss and sing together, to take off their shirts, to be in that frenzy? What kind of space is that? Is that not desire? Is that not passion? Is that not queer? So I think there is so much space to think and explore. And I'm always interested in, as much as we are connected with the global family, I'm always really, really interested in how these things play out within African contexts. And again, this book gives us a way and gives us ways of thinking through, seeing these issues and discussing them. And I think that's what makes this book a marvel.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Before I hand over to you, Gibson, and I am grateful for the comments that came through, and particularly the last parting thoughts. I think that we need to be very careful about the way in which we are able to hold conversations and to engage on particular matters. Lesego brought up something very important about how there is these stratifications that exist, and these stratifications privilege some identities and erase some identities. And I think that when we speak to trans subjectivities and trans realities, we need to be extremely, extremely careful about not finding ourselves barring from, academic freedom and freedom of speech, but to bar ourselves from finding ourselves in a position where we find ourselves to be spreading misinformation or expressing views that may be viewed as to be extremely, extremely discriminatory, other subjectivities within fairness. So I'd just like to, as my parting words, to share that we are here to engage And in our engagements, we must be very conscious of how we are able to engage in a nuanced and authentic way without expressing or finding ourselves falling into the gap of misinformation and perpetuating discriminatory views. I will close off by handing over to our author and keynote, Prof. GIBSON NCUBE, to share your final thoughts before we close off the program. I know we're running a bit out behind schedule. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for all the comments and all the questions that were asked in engaging with this book. I found that very productive to hear the different ways in which people are able to engage and to resonate with this book. And yeah, unfortunately, I did not have enough copies today to sell them with any of you, but you can always find the copies on the NISC website and order from them if you're in Cape Town from Clark's Books. And yeah, and also for the space and this opportunity to speak about my book, and also to my sister. It's the first time that I've spoken about my work to someone from my family. Thank you.
I would like to thank our panelists and our author. Can we give them a round of applause, please? It has been a greatly engaging conversation, and I would like to request to move on to the program. But prior to that, you are welcome to take back your seats in the tables away from the public sphere so that we can move on with the program. So that I don't do what the next speaker is going to do, I will just hand over to Prof. Zetu Madebeni, the SARChl chair in gender, sexualities, and queer studies at the University of Fort Hare, who has not been able to join us physically today, but has been with us online and has sent her message of thanks via video to close off this wonderfully engaging morning session. So I would like us to just take a moment to engage with Prof. Madebeni's vote of thanks. Thank you so much.
Closings are never an ending. They're an invitation to what lies beyond, behind, and what else lingers. And so we have this experience, for example, when we're watching a film and there are credits at the end of the film. And these credits, they don't only just talk about who did what, but they're also an invitation for the viewer to go and do further research on who was responsible for writing the score, creating the music, producing the film, and doing the lighting, etc., etc. And these make possible for new projects to exist. So there's always an afterlife to an ending or to what has ended at that moment. And in this afterlife of this particular event, what you see is the credits are the people responsible. So I would like to thank the Unisa team, in particular, the Transformation Office in the College of Human Sciences, the media team at Unisa, who have made it possible for us to participate in this event online, the conferencing venue team, and also I would like to thank or as the SARChl chair in Sexualities, Genders, and Queer Studies at the University of Fort Hare. I'd like to also thank the team that I work with. Many of them, well, all of them, are actually at this event. And I would like to thank in particular the new formation that is part of the SARChl in SARChl chair in Sexualities, Gender, and Queer Studies, which is a network of researchers who are dedicated to queer studies, of developing queer studies and sexualities and gender studies in the country. And they're based in different parts of the country. And you have met many of them, including the panelists, Dr. Princess Sibanda, Mr. Goran Pele, and Dr. Precious Simba, as well as our host or co-host, Melusi Mdungwa. So thank you to all of you for making this event a wonderful event, and also for engaging the work of Professor Ncube. And also I'd like to thank in particular Professor Ncube for allowing us to engage with his work. It is not, it's always, I can imagine, always very difficult to put yourself out there and see how people are going to respond to your work. And so thank you for allowing us the opportunity to really engage your very important text on queer bodies in African films. And one thing that I really appreciated about this book, Professor Ncube, is really how you have paid attention in terms of bringing different African regions together for film. And this we can accept and acknowledge that it's actually not easy. So doing that through queer bodies is even more challenging, because we do know the ways in which, within the particularly Southern African focus, we almost just only particularly focus on South Africa, not even on Southern Africa. But what you've done is to extend those borders, to talk about the Maghreb region, talk about East Africa, etc. And the differences in production, audience reception, distribution, and visual representations of queerness across Africa are difficult to narrate in a cohesive form. Yet, in this book, there is a slow and laborious work that makes the scholarly work stand out by bringing different voices together rather than singling out different regions. So we're not focusing only on East Africa or Southern Africa, but we're bringing the conversation together. There are connections between films made in Kenya and in South Africa, as well as between those in Uganda, Egypt, and Tunisia. In theorizing intimacy, desire, race, class, and the body in African films, it is possible to arrive at different conclusions, ones that are more generative and offer new, limitless possibilities. While it is important to signal the importance of Pan-African consideration of queer bodies, or what Ncube calls a specific Pan-African dialogue, we need to ask what this means when other parts of Africa are omitted. And this question is not just about this book, it's also about the kinds of work that we do as African scholars. So what is it that who gets omitted from discourses or work that poses itself as African? How do we make sense of a Pan-African text that does not consider West Africa and the African diaspora? What version of Pan-Africanism is considered not only in this book, but in this book and also in many other texts, when Rayland Rabaka argues, and I quote from Rayland Rabaka, "We cannot conceive of any form of Pan-Africanism that excludes any person of African ancestry," close quote. So most importantly for me, it is the conversation between spaces and a new way of imagining queer life in Africa and in the African diaspora that would lead us to telling new stories, stories that this book queer bodies in African films has started etching in terms of bringing together a conversation between different parts of the continent by gazing on African queer bodies. And so the invitation at the end of this is, what new stories are you willing to tell that open up conversations about what it means to be queer and African in this continent? So thank you very much for being part of this conversation, and look forward to engaging with you in other spaces at another time.
And that brings us to the end of today's event. Thank you very much, Prof. Madebeni, for those parting words and for the vote of thanks that you've shared. This is the book, everybody. This is the book. Thank you very much for making my job a simple one and an easy one. We have reached the end of our program, and we can now all enjoy some refreshments. As viewers said, we will feed you here by the University of the Land. So let people eat. Thank you so much and have a good afternoon.